Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'm going to start the webinar now.
Great. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Thanks to everyone for joining this panel entitled Sinicizing Religion in China. I'm Sophie Richardson. I'm Human Rights Watch's China Director, but massive thanks to the International Campaign for Tibet and to CSW for organizing this event this morning, which comes at a particularly good moment. This is a side event for the 47th session of the Human Rights Council, which I think we're all hoping will take up more of these China-specific issues. And we want very much for this to be an interactive discussion this morning. I'm going to introduce my fellow panelists and put some questions to them, but people can post questions in the chat, and we're going to try to reserve some time for that at the end of the event. So start thinking about questions, and you can post those throughout the event. And time permitting, our friends, our diplomatic friends from states are also welcome to make a brief comment. We'll do our best to set aside time for that. And Claire from CSW will be monitoring the chat throughout the course of the event. So let me just quickly introduce an all-star panel this morning, some old friends, some new ones. First and foremost, we have Kiri Kankhwende, whose surname I'm really hoping I pronounced properly. Excellent, thank you very much. I hate mispronouncing people's names. Who's a fantastic journalist who doesn't realize that I've actually been tracking her work for some time, and it's great to know that she is now heading up the Press and Public Affairs office at Christian Solidarity Worldwide, with which HRW does a lot of work. You're great friends of ours. We also have joining us the marvelous Professor Tim Gross, who is himself an astonishing scholar at the Rose-Hulman Institute of Technology, but is also one of a group of scholars who have stood up so courageously and in such a principled way for all of the people, particularly across the Uyghur region, that they've been writing about for years, historians, anthropologists, linguists. It's a new and different world in China studies, and I really credit Tim and some of his colleagues for staking out those positions. The world might be a different place if academia had done that for longer. And last but certainly not least, the amazing Palmo Tenzin, who is an advocacy and research officer at ICT. I suspect this event is largely a result of her brainstorming and an effort to get some more of these issues on the council's agenda. So just to try to get the conversation going, we know that Xi Jinping began using the term sinicization to refer to policy towards ethnic groups in about 2016 at the National Religious Work Conference. And maybe I'll just interject a brief HRW commentary, which is that I always find it strange to hear about things like party religious work conferences. You know, international law could not be clearer on the fact that the freedom of belief is one that individuals have, regardless of where they live or you know, where they're citizens. It's not one that governments have to give or take away or regulate into oblivion. And so just the very idea that this is a topic of party work conferences is always a little bit jarring to me. But of course, we've heard this term more and more, sinicization, on a number of different levels and with different communities, not just with Tibetans or not just with Uyghurs, but also referring to Christian communities across the country. And clearly with a political dimension to it, that to practice religion outside the confines of state-defined churches is to leave yourself vulnerable to prosecution and persecution. So what we want to try to get into today is, you know, what this term actually means for the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, how it's being used to change the practice of religion, or to put a finer point on that, how it's being used essentially to take the freedom of belief away from individuals and communities, the ways that the state now inserts itself into the practice of religion, and ultimately, you know, what religion looks like in China, what faith and belief look like in China, 10, 20, 50 years down the road if these policies aren't rolled back. And I think we'd all probably like to spend a few minutes talking too about what we can all do as individuals or representatives of organizations or communities to try to push back against some of those restrictions. So I think one of the first issues that we want to get into is what's the point of sinicization, right? What is it that the authorities are really trying to accomplish, and what does it mean to try to make religion more, for lack of a better term, culturally, that's not the right word because we all know cultures are constructed, but to make them more Sinitic or Han or Chinese. And maybe Pamo, I'll go to you first to sort of set the stage for us on that topic.
Okay, thanks, Sophie. It's a pleasure to be here, and thank you to everyone for joining the conversation. For me, having sort of followed what's been happening in China and especially in Tibet over the last few years, I think the way I've interpreted this sinicization agenda in religion is largely about imposing greater political control on the practice of religion, but not just religion, but also ethnic policy. And as we'll see in this discussion, there's a huge intersection between between religious practice and ethnic identity. But just having a look at the way the Chinese government defines the sinicization agenda, there are two elements of this goal. The first is to make religions in China more Chinese in culture, in quotations, obviously, because this is something that is being defined. And then to adapt religion to the socialist society. So the first element is very much about defining an officially approved idea of Chinese culture. And then the second one is about enforcing a loyalty to the party state and the political vision, which is of equal importance. It's not just about culture, but it's about political loyalty. That's how I've interpreted it, and that's how I've seen it being applied when we look at what's happening in Tibet. And I think the second element of the politics, of the political loyalty is important and can be seen very much in the way they try to sinicize so-called indigenous religions like Taoism and Chinese Buddhism. You would assume that they are already culturally Chinese. So the sinicization agenda is about defining a new idea of Chinese culture that supports the party state. But what I think is it has very little to do with religion and much more to do with nation state building. And particularly speaking on the issue of Tibet, and also this applies to East Turkestan, and for communities where religion intersects with ethnicity, the sinicization policy takes on additional layers and serves to kill kind of two birds with one stone, which is a horrible way to put it, really, but it has multiple, the sinicization agenda has multiple goals, and one of them is to eliminate distinct cultural and ethnic identities using religion. And it's important to remember that if you eliminate ethnic consciousness by dismantling the ties that bind communities, which religion plays a key role in, you detach them from each other, from their land, and from their shared history, and then also from their claims to that land and claims for just treatment and access to resources and opportunities in that land. And so I think the broader goal, which we have to think about, there's religion here, but there's also this nation building project, nation state building project, trying to legitimize their control, the party's control in the border regions.
Pamo, thanks. I think that's a really helpful overview. And Tim, maybe you could pick up on that as far as the Uyghur and other Turkic communities are concerned, where I think we've seen the state make a very sharp connection between people's faith and an explicit political agenda. But the floor is yours.
Yeah, and I want to build off of Palmo's really insightful comments when she's discussing, kind of the replacement of otherwise indigenously defined cultural and religious practices with something new in a form of state building, something more Chinese. And in my mind, that's the second part of a process, and it's multifaceted, but it can kind of boil down to two main parts, and that's this construction and replacement. Before you get that, you need to have a destruction component to it. You can't replace something if there's something already there. So I think right now what we're witnessing, and again, it's happening simultaneously, but before you're offered this alternative, which the Chinese Communist Party is at least officially and somewhat superficially doing, is that there has to be a destruction of what's already currently there. And speaking about the Uyghur region, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to separate religious expressions from linguistic expressions from otherwise, what we might consider cultural expressions. And so the destruction of, indigenously defined and expressed piety goes hand in hand with the ways that Uyghurs speak, with the ways that Uyghurs greet each other. And we see again this is coming from all directions. This total assault on Uyghur culture, where again I think the core of it is religion, but it needs to make sure that it covers its entire ground, to the extent where there are certain greetings that are criminalized. Students as early as primary school are taught the quote unquote dangers of fasting. And then, of course, now with the criminalization of otherwise normal religious practices, mosque attendance, adults fasting during Ramadan, embarking on Hajj, that's not part of a state. And who can remind you of socialist states, plan tours to Mecca. These all go hand in hand, right? And so these tight controls are part of, I think, this first phase of destruction. And then when there's nothing left, there's the alternative, and the alternative is a newly defined and fully sinicided version of religion. But as Pommel says, it's more about nation building. It's about shifting loyalties away from faith communities and other cultural ties that lie outside the People's Republic of China, and kind of pulling them closer to Beijing.
Yeah, that's helpful. And Kiri, I'm hoping that you can help fill in the picture for communities where a distinct ethnicity or language isn't necessarily at play, that even Han Christians are feeling the impacts of this campaign as well. Maybe you can help us understand those dimensions too.
Absolutely. Although to a different scale to what the Tibetan Buddhists and the Uyghur Muslim community are experiencing, there are other communities as well who are also being targeted under this campaign. And the experts and religious leaders that we've spoken to say that it's not really about assimilation to Chinese culture. For example, you might have in the Catholic community, you might have a village that has been Catholic for several generations, hundreds of years. They worship in a church built by their fellow Catholic neighbors. They take Mass with a Chinese Catholic priest. They identify as Han Chinese. They speak Mandarin and worship in their own language. And yet, simply by dint of being Catholic, they're not seen as, I suppose, they need to sinicize even more. It's just not enough. And so that's a major concern. The religious leaders that we've spoken to say that you have to look at the practical outworking of it, because you have on one hand what the regulations say and the broad interpretation being taken by the local authorities in implementing these regulations. And it's important to understand the background. There's never been a policy guaranteeing religious freedom in Chinese history. Religion was always subordinate to the emperor, and who was also seen as a godly figure. And that was the bottom line. And in many ways, we're being told that the sinicization of Christianity in particular is a restoration to traditional culture. But after the Communist Party came to power, the large-scale reforms that we saw started with Christianity. One, by creating, as Tim has referred to, the sort of state-sanctioned version of Christianity through this three self-patriotic movement, and Through that, they have now reached out further to now try and bring all of religion under heel to the Communist Party. We have a video which will say a bit more on this from a man called Mr. Jiang Chan, one of the first religious cadres in China's restored religious management department after the Cultural Revolution ended. He was a former director of the religious division of Guizhou Provincial Civil Religious Affairs Bureau and was in charge of Christianity and Buddhism. He's a researcher and author of the Chinese missionary movement and a member of a Chinese house church. So my colleague is just going to cue that video up now.
基督教中国化的背景，随着共产主义运动在全世界的破产，执政的意识形态合法性受到挑战。崇尚儒家的习近平希望在中国文化传统中寻找资源。一个叫做卓新平的体制内的专家，他是全国人大常委的常委，也是打击法轮功的重要推手。这个卓新平的个人看法就此上升到了国家战略。中国梦作为基督教中国化的政治切入点，基督教中国化作为中国梦的实验田。在基督教中国化的3要素的文章中，卓新平指出，基督教中国化是一种政治定位，要义是对中国政治的认同，对中国社会的适应，对中国文化的表达。他认为基督教影响了国家安全。假如基督教在中国一教独大，甚至一教独霸，势必恶化中国的宗教生态，有损中华民族文化的多元性与主体性，影响社会的和谐乃至国家安全。卓新平把与境外敌对势力勾结，推行西方的政治理念和文化价值，香港的战争等都算在基督教的身上。2016年，习近平以执政党最高规格主持召开了全国宗教工作会议，会上正式提出一个重要的任务，就是支持我国宗教坚持中国化方向。在较早的中央统战工作会议上，他以绝对的口吻说，积极引导宗教与社会主义社会相适应，必须坚持中国化的方向。基督教中国化改变了基督教信仰的核心，除了在意识形态层面的宣传之外，中共打着依法治国的旗帜，出台一系列的法律法规来推动宗教中国化，打压任何不认同该方向的宗教团体。新的宗教事务条例、中华人民共和国境内外国人宗教活动管理规定、宗教团体管理办法与宗教教职人员的管理办法等等法律法规的出台，让宗教中国化不仅是一个口号，更是有国家机器支持的强制行为。这是对宗教和信仰自由这个基本人权的公然宣战。国际社会必须充分认识到所谓宗教中国化的本质，并采取行动制止这样的野蛮行为。
Kiri, thanks very much. It's extraordinary to see somebody who's in that kind of a position sharing those reflections. And maybe actually we can pick up on one of the points that he made and do a little bit of a lightning round to talk about some of the new laws and restrictions that we've seen for each of these communities. Tim, I actually wanted to start with you. You know, now every time I hear the phrase China Dream, I sort of think of the nightmare for Uyghurs and others in that region. What are some of the new laws and restrictions or informal practices you've seen for those communities that you think have had the greatest impact on individuals' ability to practice and express their faith?
And that's a great question. That's a great question. I want to actually build upon the remarks that we just saw in the short
Sure.
film clip. And that is how I think, we can conceptually connect the Tibetan case with the Uyghurs and Kazakhs and Christians with the CCP's attempt to tie these religious groups to quote unquote foreign hostile forces. And so in other words, that another element of this is, so we have these religious identities, these ethnic identities that may clash or may not, they may not be completely integrated in a Chinese nation state. But then there's this added element where because a lot of the knowledge and the community bonds for these groups originate outside of PRC borders. And of course, His Holiness and the government in exile in Dharamsala. So the important religious figures and now many of the most important religious institutions of this kind of dare call it Tibetan Buddhism now actually exists outside the PRC. Of course, for Uyghurs, you have cultural links with Turkic groups in Central Asia, and of course with the Ummah, the global community of Muslims, and then Christianity, especially Catholicism, of course with the papacy, et cetera, et cetera. So we also see this new xenophobia almost that has really taken root within the CCP's leadership. And I think that's also fueling this campaign against religion, or at least to control it to a degree that we haven't seen since the Cultural Revolution. And then to pick up on Sophie's question, I think this segues into it. We do see these crackdowns again, like we haven't seen for decades. And religious expression in Uyghur communities, especially in the southern oases of the Tarim Basin, have always been, I think, more severe than other parts of China. But we're seeing these restrictions extended to a greater, to a kind of a broader population amongst Uyghurs. So, for example, party members and individuals that have employment with the state always face strict restrictions in terms of how they were able to express themselves as Muslims, and it basically boiled down to you couldn't, that this was a conflict of interest. If you were a party member or worked for the state, then by association you had to essentially give up your religious identities. At least you couldn't practice anymore. But what we're seeing is that these restrictions are being extended from the individual to the individual's immediate family, including spouses, fathers, mothers, children, and then being extended even now to extended family members, right? And so we don't actually know how far it goes, but is it aunts and uncles, is it cousins? But again, they're casting a wider net on where these on who is unable to participate in religious activities if there's someone in the family that's somehow associated or employed by the state. But even if you are granted legal permission to participate in religious activities, you're still subjected to a type of surveillance that we haven't seen before. And this is now entered into life cycle rituals that are important amongst Uyghurs that have, again, these really, really intimate ties with Islam. So for example, naming ceremonies, circumcisions, weddings, and funerals, where at this point right now, you have to invite a party member or a local cadre to participate in the event. In some circumstances, they actually preside over the event. You have to apply to hold these life cycle rituals several days in advance, and you have to actually be granted permission to, for example, hold a funeral for a loved one. And again, during the funeral, you have to have someone that represents the state there overseeing it to ensure that there's no quote unquote illegal religious activity going on. So again, even if you're permitted to express yourself quote unquote freely or more freely than an individual who has ties with the party state, you're still subjected to, again, this type of human surveillance that we haven't seen for decades.
Tim, thanks. I think that's reminiscent of some of the efforts that we've written about in the past in Tibetan areas, where it seems like there's a very clear effort to break connections between generations of monastics in particular communities, not necessarily the same kind of surveillance at life cycle rituals. But Palma, do you want to jump in and talk about some of what you guys are tracking, new laws, regulations, and their effects across Tibetan areas?
Yes, I think it's a useful discussion to see what's happening in Tibet. I mean, we've always known and seen the control on the monastic population. So, I mean, Tibetan Buddhism is such a key part of Tibetan identity, and the monastic institutions have always been targeted and controlled. But since the sinicization agenda has sort of been spearheaded from 2017, I mean, even before we saw restrictions, but we've seen a much more systematic, multi-pronged, strategic sort of attack on religion, and that's very much been backed by a very strategic legal apparatus. There's a structure behind it that seems like it's backed by laws, but of course these laws are very vague in how they define what are allowed and sort of unallowed or illegal activities, religious activities. So what's been most striking for us is the actual use of the language sinicization in the new laws that have been passed since 2017. And we were following especially Order number 13 on measures on managing religious groups, but also the more recent Order number 15 on measures for the administration of the religious clergy, which were passed in 2021. And they were really interesting because they really expanded sort of what was required of the clergy. There were certain behavioral requirements that you have to promote the sinicization agenda. It was no longer okay just to support it or just to sort of be a passive adherent to it, but you had to promote it and sort of participate in indoctrinating, the students, monastic students. But what we also saw was increasing behavioral controls on that were employed by new information collection requirements, but also behavioral evaluations. And so you see this sort of very bureaucratic administration that's now being built to really monitor what the monastic community is doing. And then also what is very unique in the restrictions to Tibetans is the sort of insistent reiteration that the Chinese Communist Party has the sole authority to recognize reincarnate lamas or tulkus, and in particular the reincarnation of the Dalai Lama. And so that has been consistently reiterated since 2007, but in these new religious laws that have been released since 2017, they've just repeated that, and that also applies to Catholic bishops. So what we see is just really deep institutionalization of these plans to intervene in the leadership succession of the Dalai Lama and other influential and very important community leaders in Tibet.
Right.
But I just want to also mention that there are also attacks on religious practice for the lay people. So it doesn't just apply to the monastic institutions. And as Tim mentioned, in the Uyghur case, you do see restrictions on public servants and also on children or minors under the age of 18 from visiting religious sites. And for Tibetans, the act of circumambulating a sacred site is it's a community activity. It's not just a religious activity, and that is also heavily restricted, especially for public servants. And recently we saw an article come out of Tibet just in May, reporting on a new code of conduct for party civil servants to no longer to participate in not practicing religion, not wearing or carrying religious regalia or religious sort of materials like your rosary beads, and trying to encourage those around you to not practice religion through reciting mantras or to be wearing certain religious clothes. So it's attacking both the institution, but also just the everyday practice of religion.
Yeah, I thought we had bottomed out when we saw authorities in the Uyghur region banning certain names because they were too Islamic, and then banning retired government officials in Tibetan areas from performing Kora and threatening to withhold, sort of standard state benefits, retirement pensions, things like that, if they were seen practicing publicly, which sort of tantamount to telling them to stop breathing. But Kiri, one of the things that the professor mentioned in the video that I thought was quite interesting was about efforts to control different faith communities' contacts with their counterparts outside the country. And so I wondered if you think if that was sort of particularly a concern with respect to Christian communities, or whether, we've certainly seen efforts to limit Tibetan monasteries' contacts with their sister communities outside the country, or to effectively criminalize Uyghurs' relationships with Muslim communities in other countries. But I'd love to hear you talk about this and any other particular new restrictions that you're seeing for the communities that you track.
Absolutely. So I think particularly as Christianity is sometimes often cast as a foreign religion, efforts to discourage ties with their counterparts abroad is seen. There was one Catholic bishop who was denied his office because he had attended the 2016 World Youth Congress with his fellow Catholic counterparts. It was just a youth conference, but he was barred from higher office because of it. It has obviously huge implications for Christians. And some of the other things that we're seeing, as I alluded to earlier, that creep from what's in the regulations and then what's happening in their practical outworking with people, with local authorities particularly, taking the broadest possible interpretation. So for instance, when it comes to under 18s attending religious services, they're not barred. But what we are seeing with many Christian communities, particularly in registered churches, is that they're being cut away from their youth activities, summer camps, and some of these camps have been running for years, but suddenly they can't attend. And that's in the registered churches, just this narrowing of the space. For unregistered churches, with all these new regulations, the situation is simply that they're not really allowed to exist at all. Any gray area that they had has completely disappeared. We've seen unregistered churches forced to shut down, their leaders arrested, their church members harassed, whether they're in leadership or not, and that includes children. It's as you say, I was struck when you sort of said, we thought we bottomed out. Every time you sort of think, well, it can't get much more than this, the net sort of tightens ever more. There are huge implications for this with regards to Christians and their counterparts abroad, but particularly for Catholics who are appointed by the Pope and now face this tension between what the government will allow and what and the Vatican.
Right. Kiri, I want to stay with you for a sec, but I also want to remind people that in a few minutes we'll start taking questions from the audience. So feel free to start posting those, and Claire will keep an eye on them for us. But it certainly seems that one of the common elements all three of you have mentioned is not just the formal, but also, we all know there's what the laws and regulations say on paper, and then there's what happens in practice. And I think all three of you have spoken, Kiri, you just now, about under 18s, Palmo, you the same, Tim, you talking about these life cycle rituals. And that seems to be it's hard to believe that that's an accident, right? The effort to intervene, not just with adult practitioners, but indeed to take steps to affect the way religion can be practiced for subsequent generations. And so maybe each of you could speak a little bit about, you know, what you think the implications are for you know, I'll use the word integrity in the sense of keeping something together, the integrity of a particular religious community, for education, for language. You know, what happens further down the stream if these kinds of regulations continue to play out over coming years? So Kiri, why don't you pick up where you left off with your point about, you know, especially for Catholics and the tension with the Vatican. You know, let's say that continues and you see these informal practices, you know, where teenagers aren't allowed to gather together to talk about their faith. Play that out over the next 20 years, and what does the world look like for them?
Yes, the implications are huge, because the youth are the future of any religious movement, and Christians are no different, Catholics are no different. For Protestants as well, education is a key issue. They're seeing, not only in terms of being there, you know, in terms of under 18s attending church, but also homeschooling. Many of them find they're not the only homeschooling community in China, but Protestants in particularly find the state education system very hostile, and the emphasis on political education very problematic. But that space they had for homeschooling and is being shut down as well. Homeschool groups are being disbanded. Those who produce Christian resources are being arrested. Churches that used to provide space for them to study and for the children to gather are also being prohibited from doing that. So it really, in terms of the future, it is very, very difficult, particularly as the party tries to sort of insert, I'd say, things like, you know, instead of hymns, singing pro-communist songs and having your sermons vetted. It does have a threat to not just the future of the religious group, but also just the integrity of worship, really, and being able to that freedom, which, as you correctly alluded to in your introductions, a fundamental human right, not to be granted as a gift, but which accrues to every person just by dint of being human, is under threat. And there are many brave people continuing in their, I guess, to keep the faith, so to speak, but it is incredibly difficult. And I wouldn't want to be completely apocalyptic, but I do just want to say that it is incredibly hard, and there are many brave people trying their best as each new regulations come out to find a bit of space, but it's incredibly difficult now.
Yeah, I would certainly agree with that. Palma, we've one of the things we've written about in the past is, you know, that Tibetan Buddhism has a very strong tradition of teachers working with subsequent generations. You know, that there are very strong links, or that Tibetan Buddhism has relied on those very strong links between a teacher and the students to carry on. And, you know, I think the implications are obvious for what happens if that's not permitted or if it's managed by the state. But fill us in on what that, you know, what the consequences could be for Tibetans.
I think in terms of religion, the consequences sort of are far-reaching, because as many know, Tibetan Buddhism is so central to Tibetan identity that it carries a lot of the historical knowledge, cultural knowledge, religious knowledge, philosophical knowledge, and a lot of this is restricted from, is not taught in schools, because first Tibetan language is being gradually phased out and being replaced by Mandarin Chinese language education in schools. And so you don't, and any references to Tibetan religion or Tibetan fables or histories that mention religion are banned from texts, because they're religious and they should be kept away from educational resources. So then you have this vacuum, this huge loss of sort of Tibetanness, of Tibetan knowledge, history, and culture. in an education system that translates texts that come from sort of Beijing or other major Chinese cities. So like the educational resources are just completely out of context if you're a Tibetan student, on the plateau, or if you're a nomad reading about the Great Wall of China or another major historical site in China. So what you get is a huge loss of just Tibetan knowledge, but then you also have a loss of like what Human Rights Watch have written. What we've also seen is that that Tibetan monasteries can no longer provide supplementary language classes, which has always been a source for young and old to go back to refresh their language skills, to gain access to texts or history books that the monasteries have been able to either have learned elders to teach, or to find sources where you can access such knowledge. And so what we see is the younger generation doesn't have the access to Tibetan language education, but they also don't have access to sort of the alternative sources that existed in the past as a lifeline. That lifeline has been cut. And so I think it's a really desperate situation for the young people, because you lose a sense of yourself. That there's something missing, that there isn't literature around you that you can access easily to explain your life experience, right, or your place in the world and your place just on this land that is very unique.
Yeah, I think it's sort of an excruciating prospect longer term of the loss of language. Tim, I'm gonna change this question up a little bit for you, because you've, I think, indicated what you think the long-term consequences are. But could you imagine a scenario in which large parts of the Uyghur community either give up actively practicing their faith and or start worshiping in the state-run churches because it's the only option available to them? I think one of the most interesting things about the Tibetan community is that despite the Chinese government having poured huge amounts of money and political resources into trying to persuade people, for example, to switch their loyalties to the Beijing chosen Panchen Lama, it hasn't worked. Right? It's really it's a failed strategy, because I think they can't wrap their heads around the depth of people's faith and how that exists and why people care. But can you? And I mean, I don't have any reason to suggest that people in Uyghur areas would be any more susceptible to this strategy. I'm just curious to know whether you think the repression is creating a different kind of response.
Unfortunately, right now, I think with the severity of state violence, especially the disappearing Uyghur people in Kazakhs too, that most people don't dare to cross anything that may resemble a red line. And so, we're seeing, this people being gripped, almost paralyzed by fear, and giving up at least public, and by public I mean within the home, because of course Uyghur families and Kazakh families are subjected to home surveillance and homestays. That they wouldn't dare to perform any sort of pious act that could be interpreted as abnormal or illegal religious activities. And even at religious sites that have been officialized by the state, and therefore, if you again aren't part of the party, if you're not a student, if you're not a retired official, you are permitted to to worship. That we see mosque attendance going down rapidly and dramatically, and almost in disturbing ways, because again, people won't dare to even perform pious acts in places designated to perform those acts by the state. And so I don't know. I'm not sure if Uyghur society en masse will turn to kind of state interpretations of Islam as an alternative, or will they rather keep their faith internally, and not have any sort of kind of public or outward expressions. But certainly, I think there's a disturbing future on the horizons. If we look at right now, the state seems to be really targeting two ends: the kind of the cultural bearers, so the elders in the community, and young people. So with the destruction, for example, of one mosque and the criminalization of namaz, or the 5 obligatory prayers, you have not just a destruction of a physical structure of the mosque, but you have the destruction of the jama'at, or the mosque community. And this mosque community is really where non-state cooperation and welfare comes from. So every Friday after mosque is when the elders, will talk about concerns in the village. And if these mosques are being destroyed, or if worship's being criminalized, you're going to see the weakening of this Jama'at community. And then simultaneously, you have young people in school, primary school students, middle school students, high school students, who are being told that not only is parts of religious practice superstitious, but it's also harmful to society. And they're being told to pass this knowledge at home, that for example, fasting can have severe health, or could carry severe health risks to it. So again, it's working on both ends. So a dismantling of the religious elders, who are the cultural bearers, and then we have young people being told that religious practice is dangerous. And again, if this continues, there could be a really, I think, kind of unsettling future upon us.
Yeah. I'm going to remind folks that I've got 2 more questions for the panelists. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
If I can quickly add, I just wanted to mention one little anecdote about sort of the costs of erasing memory across the generations, especially with regard to religious freedom. Once when I was in Tibet many years ago, I had some people ask me to identify who was the Panchen Lama and who was sort of the 13th Dalai Lama. They had an image and also an image of the Karmapa. So these are like our top 3 religious leaders. And there were some elders that knew, but some people who didn't. And they asked me, because I was from outside, and they said, which one is which? And I was really surprised and shocked, because I thought we all knew this. But then I realized, obviously, that these images, they're so repressed, you're not allowed to carry them. You shouldn't be parading them around in your altar. And so gradually, people, if you don't see it, you don't know who is who, you don't know their roles in history and in our communities. And so that is a consequence. You eliminate that connection, and that history. So that was quite shocking to me, and I'm sure that this was over a decade ago, and so I imagine things are much worse, considering the level of censorship that exists in terms of technological censorship.
Yeah, the surveillance, I think, capacities of the state make all of these problems exponentially worse. But maybe we could just do a quick round, and you could each give us one example of what happens when the communities you track try to resist or push back. Give us an example of what's happened to some people. And Kiri, do you want to start?
Sorry, I was having a bit of technical difficulties there.
Okay.
Yes, there's zero tolerance when we've seen Christians and other communities push back against this intrusion into their religious lives. For example, in 2018, a group of pastors issued a joint statement entitled "A Declaration for the Sake of the Christian Faith," which condemned acts of persecution, contempt, and misunderstanding from government departments as acts which infringe on the human freedoms of religion and conscience. Sadly, since then, several signatories have been arrested. This includes the leaders of churches such as Early Rain Church, Livingstone Church, Beijing Zion Church, Beijing Shouwang Church. At CSW, we've been working on the cases of a number of church leaders affiliated with these churches being harassed through the judicial system, facing long sentences on trumped-up charges. And sadly, this is not unusual. It's state-led and state-implemented.
Yeah, Tim, what's your take on that question?
Yeah, absolutely. With similar to the Christian communities, there's zero room right now for any pushback amongst Uyghurs and Kazakhs, especially as it comes to religious restrictions. To the fact that in rural communities, outside mosques, before the daily prayers, or government representatives keeping track of who comes in and who comes out. In larger cities, they have these kind of large digital headquarters that have surveillance cameras pointing outside the mosques and in the mosques. So again, they can record, and it's centralized and collectible of who's going in. So you're not going to want to circumvent these obstacles with the fear, with the likelihood of detention. So yeah, there's just really little room. It's such a suffocating, I think, atmosphere right now in Uyghur and Kazakh communities.
Yeah, yeah. Palma, do you see anything different in Tibet? Loads of from other parts of the country, Tibet, and expressing at least some interest in Tibetan religion and culture, but I'm guessing that does not, in your mind, equate to greater respect when people try to assert their faith. Tell us what your view is.
Sorry, I missed some part of that question just because
Oh,
of the
sorry,
connection.
just asking, what happens when communities try to resist these constraints and practices they want to see fit?
I think one of the most, I guess, illustrative examples has been the cases of Lhanga and Yajinka, which are these quite popular, incredibly well-established Buddhist institutions with populations at each over about 10,000 residents, Buddhist residents, students who were studying Tibetan Buddhism. And in 2017 and 2019, respectively, we saw the populations just halved. 5,000 that were expelled from Lhanga, and in Yajinka, you saw over 7,000 expelled. And in both cases, you saw resistance, but then what you saw was the governing bodies were under such pressure that they themselves, the Buddhist teachers, were sort of stuck in between the party sort of apparatus and then their students, and they had to play the role of sort of mediating so that they could at least exist in some form rather than completely being shut down because the students wouldn't leave. And so what you saw was there is resistance, but then to survive, some people decide to leave or to accept the circumstances because they see the collective punishment being used. So it's just, all I can say is it's a very bleak scenario because in those situations in Lhanga and Yajinka especially, we saw the expelled nuns from Yajinka being subjected to political training and education and back in the Tibet Autonomous Region. So and
so being forced to sing publicly.
Yeah, these very patriotic songs, and then the prospect of being able to access or enter another Buddhist institution was very unlikely.
Yeah. Well, I'm now going to ask you all to turn on a dime from describing all of these very bleak scenarios for people of different faiths, and tell us what you think can be done. This is, we are having this conversation around the 47th Human Rights Council session. So maybe each of you could offer up one or two suggestions of, how you would like to see the world respond to these developments. And Palma, I think maybe we'll go first with you, and then we'll flip over to questions for the panel from the audience.
Okay, I think this is a good sort of change of tone. Maybe there is still hope in terms of what is possible for us to do on the outside. I think it's really important to just reiterate that this right to freedom of religion is worth protecting, and it's especially important right now when it's under such attack in China. And I think what we can do is the international community can really come together and to come together to denounce that to denounce the sinicization project. We have to explicitly mention it. We have not seen anyone come out to really explicitly identify this broad, far-reaching project. We talked about Tibet, we talk about Christians, we talk about Uyghurs, but actually this is a much broader project that needs to be to be identified, to be explicitly condemned, to really recognize it upfront, and to call for action, greater action, but also to call for access to China, so that much more can be understood about what's actually happening with respect to freedom of religion. Because one of the biggest issues is why we get a lot of the stories that come out, we don't actually understand the full picture. We don't really know what's been happening in terms of what is being taught in religious institutions anymore, what is being censored exactly. And I think what's really important is we do need action at the Human Rights Council level. We do need Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion and Belief to come out with a statement or a communication that condemns this policy that has impacts on multiple religious groups. And I think all countries need to come together to really make sure that we protect this very important international right, international law, as well as just human rights in general. If you don't protect this, then we are gradually seeing the dismantling of this architecture that exists to protect individuals who are at risk of very serious persecution.
Yeah, no, all very good points. Tim, what's on your to-do list?
Yeah, certainly I think the options for civil society are becoming fewer and fewer, and I think that more of the responsibility has to be on at the kind of the international government level. I think though that there's still a responsibility to wherever you are to raise awareness of these issues, but far too many people still have never heard of groups like the Uyghurs and Kazakhs and Tibetans. They don't know that there's a thriving and used to be growing community of Christians, especially amongst Han Chinese in China. So raising awareness is, of course, important, and putting the pressure on our own governments to not just engage in this kind of empty rhetoric, but actually use this rhetoric and have it translate into meaningful political action. I think that action is only going to come from pressure from their own populations. And I think that for scholars or those engaged in these areas more regularly and more intimately, there needs to be ongoing documentation, and so it not just issuing allegations or claims, but actually documenting what the CCP is doing to their faith-based communities, and archiving it, and so that these can be used as pieces of evidence for if there is a time that the CCP is brought to justice for these types of kind of human rights crimes.
Yeah, on our bad days, we on HW's China team try to remind ourselves that if nothing else, we are helping fill in the brief for the prosecution at some point further down the track. The idea that people should be held accountable for serious human rights crimes. Kiri, tell us what you think we can try to achieve to protect these rights.
Absolutely. Well, definitely more needs to be done to monitor, document, and research this sinicization campaign. NGOs have a part to play, but so do UN missions and embassies and other bodies as well. Some of our contacts have referred to it as partyization as opposed to sinicization, which gives a hint of what they think the true meaning might be. we need to pay attention to its impact beyond China's borders as well. We have some anecdotal evidence that some overseas Chinese churches are being cautious, even though they're overseas. They don't say too much about policies, that they avoid so-called sensitive topics. And of course, as we know, what is sensitive tends to vary from moment to moment, because they fear the interference, even abroad, of the Chinese Communist Party. So alongside that, I'd recommend that diplomatic missions pay more attention to freedom of religion or belief, that they send people to observe trials, that they raise the cases of human rights defenders, and in bilateral talks with China, human rights, of course, but especially freedom of religion or belief should always be on the table, and publicly. And we joined with 20 other NGOs in requesting that the UN Human Rights Commissioner, Michelle Bachelet, would urgently strengthen remote monitoring and initiate public reporting on the human rights situation across China, focusing especially on Uyghur and Tibetan regions and Hong Kong. And we would just reiterate that call. We really need to see everyone in the international community step up, because this is not just a Chinese problem, it could reach beyond the borders.
Yeah. No, you won't get an argument from Human Rights Watch about any of those recommendations. They're all, I think, very important ones. We're going to pivot now to take a couple of questions from the audience, and I'm going to read them because I'm not sure that everybody can see them. And then I'm going to disappear for a nanosecond while I plug my phone in so that I don't lose all of you. So I'll disappear for a second, but maybe we can go in answering this question in the order of Tim, and then Kiri, and then Palmo. So Big Ben writes, the word sinicization is problematic. There is still no rejuvenation of traditional Chinese culture. Everything is about the communization. The totalitarian core of the CCP has never changed. Given its brutality and the new development of surveillance systems, everybody in China is forced to assimilate to the Chinese definition or political perception of socialism. Han Chinese are the first victims. If there are Han assimilation occurring above the communist dominance in China, please point it out. So I think this question is about whether, Big Ben, you can try to clarify if I've got this wrong, is about the ways that this is a larger political campaign, that it's not just about religion, and that we see ways in which Han are repressed and forced to assume a particular profile, for lack of a better term, as well. Does anybody want to speak to that? Tim, maybe, Kiri, go ahead. Why don't you, if you don't mind taking that first?
Sorry, I didn't catch the last bit of what you said.
I can take it.
Yeah, Tim, if you want to go ahead, please.
And I think maybe what the question is getting at, and I agree, is that Han people aren't insulated from this state violence, and there's a type of state violence and control that's also being exercised on Han communities throughout the China, and certainly I agree. And there's this state surveillance and this kind of trying to control elements of daily life that make most people in most societies feel very uneasy. With that being said, I still believe that the CCP views Han culture, and I use that loosely because, of course, these cultures and these identities are they're dynamic. They're constructed, they shift. But though, with all that said, and getting rid of the academic jargon for a moment, I still think the CCP believes that Han cultural norms they are the vehicle that will bring China into their understandings of modernity and prosperity. So I disagree to some extent that there's no revitalization of quote unquote Han culture. If our understanding of Han culture is those cultures that aren't the quote unquote peripheral groups. And so, for example, we are seeing the institutionalization and the prioritization of celebrations that are usually associated with Han people, for example, Spring Festival, Guanwu Festival or Dragon Boat Festival, Mid-Autumn Festival. And so again, historically, we would typically, associate these with groups that now identify or the state identifies as Han, but they've taken these practices and they're projecting them across the entire multi-ethnic nation state. And of course, with the kind of resurrection, if you will, of Confucius and Confucianism, and I think Xi Jinping has this deep respect and admiration for Confucian values. And of course, we don't seeing, it's silly to think of China today as a Confucian state, and it's being and its policies being dictated by Confucianism. But we see a resurgence of some Confucian practices that, again, it's not necessarily has anything to do with Confucius as a philosophy, this Rujia as a philosophy, but more that it's an important cultural element of Han people. So again, this is about nation building and building a nation whose center stone or whose centerpiece are the Han people.
Right, Tim. Thanks. That's a pretty that's a very succinct answer to a very big question. Palmo, Kiri, I don't know if you want to add anything onto that. We do have another question if you'd rather dig into that one.
I think we can move on to the second question.
Okay, sure. Let me read that one to you. Thanks for your patience with my technological incompetence. Here we have what really, in a way, is the $64,000 question. Is the Chinese government too powerful for the global community to put pressure on it to stop its persecution of religious communities? Palma, do you want to go first?
If I had that answer, I think I would have already used it and applied it to the best of my abilities. Is it too powerful? I think China is still part of the global community. They aren't immune to criticism. But I don't know what to say for this, because I think it's a very hard question to answer. But I would like to think they are still responsible for their actions, just as they would expect everyone else to be held accountable for actions that affect them.
I absolutely agree with Palmo. They are not immune to criticism. And I'd go further and say that when the international community acts in concert, the force of numbers does count, even though China does have a huge influence geopolitically, especially in, I'd say, in multilateral fora where every country has a vote. There is a chance to do something if we all work together and keep raising these issues. China also needs the world. In this, the world needs China, but China also needs the world, and they're not immune to criticism. So I think that's an encouraging sign.
Yeah, I agree. I'll just add my own 2 cents onto that one, which is just to say that, I think increasingly an idea that animates various other governments and institutions is Beijing's expectations of impunity. That it will never be held accountable for anything, or its efforts to fight back against being held accountable, and whether that's for COVID, whether that's for the South China Seas, whether that's for shredding the Sino-British Joint Declaration, whether it's about any of the issues that we've been talking about here today. I think an increasing number of players are frustrated by that reality. And it's, I think, one of our collective challenges as scholars and advocates is to try to, harness that frustration and push for the kind of accountability that we would ask for any government, that we would want to see for any government, and to hold all governments to the same standards, and particularly the standards that are set out by the international human rights treaties those governments have freely joined. This is the price of entry, right? You sign up, you get held accountable. And I think there is some growing discomfort with the idea that Beijing can just do whatever it wants, including committing serious human rights crimes, and that it expects to get away with it. But I don't think there are other questions in the chat. Claire will tell me if that's not the case. I'll hang on for just a second. Oh, there is one more. Yikes, Claire, I'm not sure I can see it. I'm having a little bit of a technological breakdown. Oh, here's a good one. Ooh, I love questions like this. Here we go. Should Western nations in higher education, i.e. universities, be more open in their curriculum so international students and even domestic students have a thorough understanding of history and all religions? That's a big question. Tim, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that all levels of education need to be more inclusive of the types of communities, not just faith-based communities, but also ethnic and racial communities that are being taught, and you know, and even to the extent that there are it's more inclusive than it was even when I was in school several now decades ago. But it's not just about representation, but how these groups are represented. And so certainly it's one of my priorities. I teach at a science, technology, engineering, and math institute, but my courses almost entirely introduce and engage critically with communities of China, religious communities, etc. So yeah, so I think there's a certain and much needed sense of obligation amongst educators to make sure that they are teaching about the diversity of the world. So certainly yes, I agree that this is as we are now becoming I think more firmly positioned in a globalized community, it's our a very essential duty to make sure that as global citizens that we were talking about each other in very constructive ways.
Yeah, those are great points. Kiri, Palma, do you want to get Kiri? Go ahead.
Oh, I agree absolutely with what Tim said, and I would only add that I think we also have a responsibility to stand up for academic freedom and ensure that there is that space to do that teaching, because it's vital, perhaps more important than ever in these polarized times. But just as I referred to the overseas churches and Chinese communities being worried about the long arm of the Communist Party, we also have to ensure that in our networked academic world with campuses in China and abroad and students going back and forth, that there are some principles that are adhered to and stuck up for, because the freedom of information is incredibly important.
Yeah, Kiri, I couldn't agree. I mean, I agree entirely. We actually just published a report last week about threats to academic freedom amongst some Chinese students in Australia, where some people were being repressed, some people were doing the repressing, and the universities were essentially covering their ears with their hands and saying, we don't want any part of this in ways that we think are really problematic. And we've done work on some of these same kinds of issues in the US and the UK. And I think schools have stayed too focused on the kinds of Chinese government influence that are easier to see or talk about, Confucius Institutes or national security or particular companies or money or those sorts of things. And I think we're extremely concerned in a way about precisely what some of these questions are getting at, which is, what's happened to human beings and their ability to be exposed to different communities, the values they hold, whether they're being repressed, if they can speak freely. And I think, to have these concerns at a time when we are all more connected, right? I mean, being more connected is great in that we can learn more about each other, but it also opens up new vectors of control for authoritarian governments. And I think there's a real challenge, for schools, for governments, for bodies like the Human Rights Council to do all they can to resist that, so that we can see whose rights are being threatened and the ways that they're being threatened and what that cost is, which is for these communities I think, extraordinary. I fear that in the long run, if we can't arrest some of these trends, centuries of tradition, religion, language, history, culture are at risk. And I think that would, for human knowledge and for human beings, be a terrible loss. So given that we are at time, and I don't want to end on a bleak note, I want to thank Tim and Kiri and Palmo and CSW and ICT and everybody who joined in to listen, to think about what we can all do in our daily lives, to try to reverse some of these trends and make sure that the people who can't exercise their rights in the ways that we just have can expect to be supported by our efforts. So on that note, thank you all very much for joining. It's lovely to see everybody, and onward and upward. Thanks.
Thank you, Sophie.